Perfect. So Professor Dr. Paula Kivimaa joins us today, where she will be talking about intermediaries in sustainability transitions. Paula is Research Professor Climate and Society at the Finnish Environment Institute, SYKE, if I pronounced that right. She's also Senior Research Fellow at the Science Policy Research Unit of the University of Sussex, and has done quite some work also in the broader sustainability transitions research network, as being a steering group member of the SCRN and being one of the associate editors of the journal Environmental Innovation and Societal Transitions. Paula's research interests are the connections between public policy and innovation, experiments and intermediary actors in sustainability transitions, quite often with a focus on energy, but not always, also including building and mobility transitions. In Paula's current research, the focus is mainly on climate policy and societal developments, with a strong emphasis on national security and social justice perspectives. I'm very excited for today's talk, and without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Paula.
Okay, thank you. I'll just share my presentation, and I hope you. Okay, it takes a bit of time. I would like to, by the way, before I start, I would like to know, do you now see the presenter view or the full presentation, so I know if I need to change something?
We see the presenter view.
Okay, so I have to, don't know, how do I hide the, it just automatically picked it. This. Okay, now it should work. Okay, can you now see just the presentation?
Yes,
yeah, perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. It's really nice to come and talk in this webinar series. First of all, because it's been such an interesting set of webinars, but also the topic that I've been asked to talk about, intermediaries in sustainability transitions, is something that I got interested in probably about 10 years ago. But then the last 5 years or so, I carried out a few research projects on this theme, so it's kind of been a whole program of research for me until about a year ago, when I moved to new issues such as national security, which you mentioned. So that's kind of a topic to come, and this is the topic that I've been working on a lot with several colleagues as well. So in this talk, I sort of take a bit for granted that people already have some background on sustainability transitions and the sort of main theories, because they've been covered in the previous webinars, and a sort of deep dive into a more specific topic on intermediaries. And I try to answer these two questions. What are the conceptualizations and a bit about the theory behind intermediaries in transitions, but also what intermediaries are and what they do in the context of sustainability transitions. So this graph shows that it's still very much an emerging literature. So until last year, you could maybe see 8 or 9 papers per year focusing on intermediaries. The difference in color scales is that the period until 2017 we covered in our systematic review paper, which was published in Research Policy in 2019. So it was kind of careful assessment of the number of publications. The 3 last years, it was more like a quick look at Scopus and seeing how many papers I could find with explicit focus on this topic. And also, what I would like to point out, that even though the term intermediary is becoming increasingly used, some people talk about system builders or middle actors or knowledge brokers, and sometimes in a bit of a similar meaning as well. So I will start with the idea of concepts and theory behind this. And this graph is from the systematic review paper. And what we found really is that in the beginning, the research on systemic or intermediaries in transitions was not it was not a one stream of literature. It was not focused, and there was not necessarily like cross references between the studies. And there were sort of 4 streams of literature that these studies drew from. So one was on technological regimes and technological frames, very much behind Hels and Deuten early paper on intermediaries in these niche developments. They also drew a bit on the idea of techno-economic networks by Callan and Latour. And this work was also behind a rather extensive series of work by Marvin, Med and Hodson on intermediaries in the context of urban transition, so much more focused on climate and energy. And it was quite empirical work, but they also coined this term of strategic intermediaries. And this work then further has led to work on intermediaries in niche developments by Hargreaves, Seifang and colleagues, as well as Timothy Moss's interesting work on intermediaries specifically in the governing transitions. However, there's also, and where I come from more, there is a more innovation studies background on this idea of intermediaries in transitions, drawing on systems of innovations literature. And one key piece really was the paper on systemic intermediaries by Haravan Lenter, Mako Hackett and colleagues, which has influenced mine work and other people's work. But also then there's a literature on innovation intermediaries that has been particularly influential in my work, but also in work by Lawrence Clerks and colleagues on systemic intermediaries. So it's kind of evolved, and these are sort of early streams of the work, which has now been taken forward by many transitions colleagues. I want to talk a little bit more about the background in the innovation studies and the concept of innovation intermediaries, because I feel like it's quite important, and we don't need to start everything from scratch, and there's a lot of useful things that we can draw from there. So when in innovation studies, when innovation intermediaries are being talked about, the idea has been really to intermediaries that are bridging actors in situations where direct interaction is difficult. This could be due to high transaction costs or communications problems, like when you're trying to link innovators who develop technologies, but with those that are more efficient in marketing technologies forward. There are sort of two perspectives, at least, on this. Some see innovation intermediaries mainly as facilitators of innovation, so they're facilitating network and system building processes. There's another perspective that sees that, okay, the intermediaries are not just passing on things, but they're actually shaping the entities that are being passed on. So they have an influence in the kind of process and outcome, also in or the substance, by, for example, translating scientific knowledge. In this literature, and I've put some references if people are interested to look further, there's a lot of attention on intermediary functions. So what are the different functions and activities that intermediaries do to facilitate innovation processes? I sort of jump a little bit because I want to provide a definition before I go into the detail in how, in transition studies, this idea of innovation intermediaries has been taken forward. So this is a definition we propose for transition intermediaries in the systematic review paper. So when I'm talking about transition intermediaries, I'm talking about actors and platforms. So it doesn't necessarily need to be people or organizations, but it could be kind of platform set up that positively influence sustainability transition processes in three different ways. They can be linking actors and activities with each other. They can try to link related skills and resources, or they could try to kind of more broadly connect transition visions and demands of different networks of actors with existing regimes for the purpose of creating momentum for socio-technical system change, to create new collaborations within and across niche technologies, ideas and markets, and disrupting dominant unsustainable socio-technical configurations. So it's quite a long definition, but we kind of wanted to capture the different activities as well as the different ways in which transitions can be promoted. So who are these intermediaries? You can't, or I argue that you can't purely determine an intermediary based on an actor category. So you could say that, okay, technology transfer centers or energy agencies are intermediaries, which they often are, but actually it's much more fruitful to look at specific transition processes and identify which actors or platforms are actually conducting intermediary functions and activities. And it differs a lot in different processes. I've done quite a bit of empirical work, and in different processes, a key intermediary, in some intermediary process, it could be like a local authority agency taking intermediary action, whereas similar activities might be taken by a private foundation in another, for example. So you really need to look more looking at what is being done and by who, than just kind of categorizing actors. However, I wanted to give you some examples so you know what in previous empirical studies have been found to take on these intermediary functions. An easy example is innovation actors. So innovation agencies are often networking people or connecting resources with people. We have technology centers. Other public sector actors would include energy agencies or climate change initiatives. On community level, you often find community energy networks that are taking intermediary roles. But you also, when you look at kind of the micro level of what happens in transitions, you also find individuals. They could be architects or city planners that are taking on explicitly intermediary functions and activities. So there's kind of a big range of actors. And I wanted to show this example. This is one from a study that I did with Mari Martiskainen when we looked at intermediation in relation to how UK low energy building policy had developed during several decades. And here we kind of tried to create, we identified so many organizations, and I have to say that not usually, it's quite unusual to find such a big number of intermediaries, but in this case we found about 20, whereas if I look at the similar phenomenon in Finland, I find 3. But so here we wanted to kind of separate or create some understanding of what types of organizations have acted as intermediaries. So here we had government-initiated agencies that were typically publicly funded and had a government mandate to facilitate low energy building transitions that usually undertook piloting and experimenting activities and carried out policy assessments. A different category, which was rather influential, was this charity or social enterprises, which more emerged bottom up. They had a mix of private or public funding. They were often driven by eco-ideology, focused on sharing learning, piloting and experimenting, and policy influence. The third category is member organizations. So it would be organizations that actually receive membership funding for their activities. And they're very strongly, obviously, focused on creating and managing networks and aggregating and sharing learning. And then finally, the final category was public and private networks, which were both typically public and privately funded. In this case, had a government mandate to conduct sort of creating and brokering activities around networks for low energy building. So this is just to illustrate that even within one case, you can identify different types of intermediaries that operate on slightly different premises based on their funding base as well as their core activities. So the elements, if we want to conceptualize intermediaries in transitions, we can talk about intermediary processes. I've already mentioned intermediary functions, but also we created a typology of intermediaries, really trying to sum up previous definitions and categorizations of intermediaries to help further this area of research. And I also mentioned some other recent additions. So this, the idea of intermediary processes really comes from this innovation intermediaries literature, which I mentioned. For example, in particular, the work of Stewart and Husalo, who identify 3 different intermediary processes, which have then been adapted to sustainability transition studies, for example, by Jake Barnes and Donald Brown. And the 3 sort of broader categories are facilitating, configuring, and brokering. And facilitating is really about sort of providing opportunities for others by educating, gathering, and distributing resources, influencing regulations, or setting local rules as sort of maybe protected spaces. So it's really about creating these spaces for others to form networks, share skills and knowledge, share funding, and this idea of providing a space with alternative rules, which of course connects very much with this strategic niche management and niche development ideas. The second process is configuring. So the idea is that, for example, a technological innovation might not be automatically usable in different contexts or for different types of users. So there's a need for processes where you're trying to align these technologies into working configurations for people. There's different types of examples, but some research in transitions context have been done about, for example, heat pumps being configured for different types of users, but also for different kind of people living in different climatic conditions. There's also more symbolic configurations because you sort of want people to accept and find new technologies or new solutions useful. So intermediaries might also be doing this sort of interpretation work, in a sense, educating users about technology and its use. And then finally, brokering, which is really kind of a core activity, of course, for intermediaries, negotiating or helping different actors to negotiate and raising support from others to support the transition processes. I just wanted to show this. I'm not going to explain it too much, and it's not my work, but it's work from Jake Barnes's PhD, and it's really interesting that he applied this idea of intermediary processes and also how they might work in different sequences in different cases. So he looked at different cases and how there's a certain sequence in which these configuring, brokering, and facilitating happen, which might also influence the outcome. But then these are, of course, also connected to the users, the local system, and the external environment. And you can kind of see the elements of the MOP in this picture, but it's done in the context of the local system rather than a broader national or global regime we often see. Then saying, going back to this idea of intermediary functions in transitions, and this is where I personally started off with when I started working on intermediaries. If you're interested in functions more, you can look up my 2014 paper. By the way, I have at the end of the presentation, I have all the full references, so you can look them up. And in this early study, I took the strategic niche management processes, articulation of expectations and visions, building of social networks, learning processes and exploration at multiple dimensions as basis, and then reviewing the innovation intermediary literature for functions and trying to place the different or create this idea of that, okay, what are the more specific intermediary functions that go under these different strategic niche management processes. So as examples, you would have obviously the articulation, how intermediaries articulate needs and requirements from the field and aggregate these to others. You would have the advancement of sustainability aims. In terms of building of social networks, you would have the gatekeeping and brokering between and the network building around the niche. The intermediaries would also act in terms of finding potential funding and also connecting those with the activities benefiting niche development. Under learning processes and exploration, you would have knowledge gathering, processing, generation, and combination, as well as provision of advice and support. But there are also many others, so there's a full list. However, there were some functions that couldn't very easily be fit under the S&M processes, and one such example is arbitration based on neutrality and trust. In a way, it would go under building of social networks, but also intermediaries can be a bit biased, at least in a sense that they are promoting a particular niche, for example, and I'll come back to this point when I describe the typology. So in addition, obviously, to niche development, intermediaries can also, if we look at the broader context of transitions, they could try to more be active in pursuing destabilization or disruption of socio-technical regimes. Could also look at them in the context of technological innovation systems and how they connect actors and processes there. Intermediaries might also not necessarily operate on the kind of whole transition spectrum, but they might be operate on a particular subsystem within a regime, such as, for example, policy intermediating for policy change. So I mentioned the neutrality issue, and this is quite central because the innovations intermediaries literature quite often assumes this idea of intermediary actors and being neutral and therefore in a good position to aid in negotiating between different parties. And this could be neutrality in terms of not being politically inclined to particular directions. It could be sort of technology neutrality. It could also be neutrality in terms of finance. So if the finance or if the funding of the operation of the intermediaries arrives equally from different sources or is kind of independent, it could be more neutral. However, when we talk about transitions, intermediary actors often in practice might be tied to the established regime, for example, because they get funding from regime actors, or they might be tied to specific niches, so really operating, for example, in the context of wave energy. And in any case, they would be not non-neutral in a sense of pursuing sustainability goals. So in one sense, pure neutrality doesn't exist, but of course, intermediaries should appear fairly unbiased on behalf of the actors it's trying to intermediate in between. So I think that is one of the core ideas. I also put this figure to aid because we also sometimes will talk about champions, and in this one paper with Mari Martiskainen, we looked into how there are different types of intermediaries, some taking championing roles and some non-championing intermediaries, and we divided this based on this idea of agency. So when you're talking about a championing intermediary, you're talking about an actor that has a strong drive or agency to push forward things as well as it carries out intermediary activities such as bridging actors, pooling resources, translating, learning. Other intermediaries are more neutral, or they might have weak agency, so they're pursuing these intermediary activities, but they're maybe more taking instructions from others or from the members of the networks to do these intermediation activities. And of course, you would then have also non-intermediating champions that have a strong drive or agency, but are not actually undertaking any of the intermediation activities. So this is just kind of a useful thing to keep in mind when we look at the huge variety in intermediation. Now I'm going to go to our typology that we're proposing in the systematic review paper, and this figure, I just wanted to place this on an MOP, but we're not doing this in the paper, just to sort of show the difference that we have 5 types that we're proposing. Systemic intermediaries and regime-based transition intermediaries typically operate on a kind of a broader regime level, whereas niche intermediaries or user-side intermediaries are either within niches or between this niche regime interface. Process intermediaries could actually operate on multiple levels. They can be on part of like very concrete on the ground projects, or they could even be more on the regime level. But I will now open up these different types. So when we're talking about systemic intermediaries, we're talking about operating on a system level between many actors and many interests. They're actors that are typically established for this purpose to intermediate. And they're actors that pursue given sustainability goals on a system level. They have an ambitiousness to also disrupt the existing unsustainable system. And they're able to do this because they're typically outsiders to specific niches, also largely to regimes, or at least they have the capabilities of being not too tied to the regimes to create spaces for multiple different niches, and they're often regarded by other actors as neutral, unbiased facilitators and brokers. So regime-based transition intermediaries have a lot of similarities. They're operating on a system level, but they're typically given their mandate by dominant regime actors. So it could be an actor set up, for example, by a national or city level government. They can be actors that are already existing, that are subsuming intermediary roles, or they could be established to intermediate. And they, similarly to systemic intermediaries, they pursue given sustainability goals, but typically more incremental solutions or political aims because they are influenced by the existing regime. Likewise, they're outsiders to specific niches, creating space for multiple alternative niches. they are regarded as a player in the existing regimes, but they're being empowered for change. And all this kind of our typology is very much emerging from this full review of literature we did. So if you're interested, you can look where we're drawing these ideas from that paper. Niche intermediaries, as the term says, it's operating on a niche level. It could happen fairly locally between local projects, or it could be a higher level of aggregation, for example, an association nationally or even globally for a particular niche technology. It often emerges when a niche develops. It pursues sustainability goals and solutions from the perspective of that niche, and then therefore it's insider to that niche, and it's often regarded as a player advancing that. So it is kind of biased towards that niche. We wanted to have this category of process or project intermediary, which is sort of a more neutral, unbiased networker, but it's important to carry out this day-to-day action, actual concrete intermediary activities in terms of connecting actors, connecting resources, and it often happens within experimental projects or transition processes. And it could be an organization or a person, organization that's established, or a person employed for this particular purpose to intermediate the day-to-day action. It's kind of implementing the context-specific priorities that are given to this actor. And the final category that comes from the literature is user intermediaries. So it's more, and I referred to this idea when I talked about the intermediary processes, where it's between a technology and use, or niche technology and dominant configuration. It's emerging among users, and it's really, the idea is to be a facilitator, sometimes a facilitator, sometimes also a representative of end use and end users. So it could be either an insider or outsider to a specific niche, but it's really taking this user interest if we're talking of any kind of transition, how we're talking, whether it's an energy transition or food transition, but kind of trying to think the practical change this transition brings to users and how to facilitate those processes. I also wanted to mention the scales, because which have already sort of come up, that of course when we're looking at intermediation, there are a lot of different scales, and you could in a way call it the intermediary onion. So you obviously have the broader regime level, where intermediation occurs on the level of kind of achieving systemic change or connecting niches to regimes. You have this kind of cosmopolitan or global niche level, where aggregating information for niche building from different localities. You have the level of multiple local projects. So for example, in a given city, carrying out intermediation to connect the different activities and actors. But then you also have the very micro level of particular projects or experiments. And in this paper, we looked at building projects. So that's why the micro scale is a building project. So even the duration of a kind of a novel retrofit or new building project might require intermediation in terms of connecting the ideas, connecting the actors. So there are a lot of different scales that are needed to advance transitions. There's another way of scales or identifying different system levels of intermediation, and this is from Wisdom Canda's new paper, which really nicely illustrates these different system levels. So when first, of course, we can talk about intermediation in a non-systemic sense between individual entities. But on system level 1, there is an intermediary which is connecting different actors or entities in one network. So an example in this paper is a sustainable business hub in Sweden that it's only intermediating between its own members. On system level 2, you actually have intermediation between different networks, and this really becomes important in transitions. So in a way, in this paper, the example is a German energy agency, which is intermediating and interacting between different sustainable energy networks. So in a given transition, whether it's mobility, energy, or food, you of course have the different, for example, niche specific networks that are being intermediated between. And then the system level 3 is also very important for transition. So it's more about intermediating between actors and their network and this broader level of institutions to achieve institutional change. And one good example that I've studied personally is the Finnish Innovation Fund SITRA, which has very much worked between actors and policy institutions. And of course, a given intermediary could do several of these activities, but this is kind of to classify the different levels. And I hope I'm not showing too many graphs, but one further important point is intermediation over time. So we could, of course, look at something statistically, but when we're talking about transitions, what happens over time becomes really important. And one of the key things is that different types of intermediation are needed when transitions advance. So in kind of pre-development, early niche development phases, you need different activities than when the niche is accelerating or when it's becoming part of the regime. There's also interesting how the ecology, so the group of intermediaries change over time. This is demonstrated in the figure on the right, which is again an example from the UK low energy building context, how in 1988 there were only 3 intermediaries really trying to advance on the new build side low energy transitions. 10 years later, new actors have emerged, but they were not necessarily all connected to each other, whereas a further 10 years later, there was a whole network of intermediaries, with the gray ones sort of being intermediaries between intermediaries, so being these sort of public-private networks that connected these different actors. And then 8 years later, you actually saw some intermediaries having disappeared, and especially the connecting ones. And these ecologies of intermediaries can also, it's not all about positive things, and there can be a lot of battles over resources for existence, who has the power to actually influence and also some to survive over time. So in this paper with several colleagues, we tried to open a little bit up how intermediation in different transition phases might differ. And here the acronym, so NI is referring to niche intermediary, PI to process intermediary, and SI to systemic intermediary. So in pre-development, you see a lot of activity, important activity for niche intermediaries in terms of connecting pilots and experiments, aggregating learning. You have process intermediaries facilitating projects. You also have some systemic intermediaries creating institutional and social spaces. However, when you go to the acceleration stage, you see more intermediaries typically, but you also see niche intermediaries taking slightly different roles, aggregating learning on a more global level, creating shared infrastructure such as different standards organizations, lobbying. You also see more process intermediaries. Regime-based transition intermediaries typically become more visible at this stage. When the transition is accelerating, new actors are getting a mandate to support these transitions in vision formation, learning, and translating. Similarly, systemic intermediaries take more active roles in negotiating and market formation, and then you have these activities by user intermediaries facilitating early user practices and configuring. Very little research exists on this phase when the new regime begins to stabilize. So if anyone's really interested, I would welcome new empirical research on this area. In that phase, niche intermediaries might cease to exist, or they become new regime intermediaries. Also, systemic intermediaries, after they've kind of conducted their activities in destabilizing the old regime, they might move on to other activities. So, I mean, this has been very conceptual, so I kind of wanted to give you an empirical example at the end of the UK low energy housing study that I did with Mari Martiskainen, just to kind of illustrate this in one particular context. And to provide some background, the UK low energy housing transition, we could talk of lack of it because it still hasn't happened. It really, like in many countries, it traces back to the 1970s oil crisis and this idea that we really need to make buildings more energy efficient. However, 50 years later, the UK building stock is still a significant source of CO2 emissions. This, of course, is the case in many countries, but this country is a particular example. There's been a variety of niches with different labels: low energy, low carbon, ecologically sustainable buildings, but none of these have not really become part of the regime. There was a very ambitious policy mix in the early 2000s, which was dismantled 15 years later. There have been some recent efforts to decarbonize heating. And what we detected when we studied this was intermediary action on many levels, from the micro level of individual projects to this system level of policy change. And by the way, when we started studying this in the early 2015, it still looked like a positive transition, but then the policy dismantle in June 2015 caused like a backtrack, what we call a backtracking phase in this picture. This picture really just shows that in this case, there's been a huge number of intermediaries set up in different stages of development. What was an interesting finding for us was that when public policy has been sort of more free market, rational, choice-based, there's been less intermediary action on the government level, but instead these sort of on the ground private charity type intermediaries have emerged to really advance things, whereas when on the periods of strong policies or regulation-oriented policies on building energy efficiency, they have actually said the government has established intermediaries to advance various aspects. So I just wanted to show some examples of policy influence, and of course intermediaries do a lot of things, but in this case we looked at especially how they influence policy. So there were examples where intermediary actors created expectations for policy development via pilot projects. An actor succeeded in lobbying mandatory supply obligations. There was a particular voluntary home energy rating scheme by one intermediary that later became or informed the government standard assessment procedure. Similarly, in takeoff or acceleration phase, new projects created expectations. Intermediaries had an important role in really aggregating the pilot experiences to advocate best practice, but there was also an example where a campaign by WWF UK really led to the setup of this sort of an intermediary of intermediaries, sustainable buildings task force, followed by energy efficiency requirements in building regulations. And there have also been one example in the backtracking phase where there was still some influence by intermediaries on the energy efficiency. So certainly in this case, intermediaries have been active. And then we also have obviously examples of how they've acted in other spheres and not policy sphere. However, there was a lot of problems. We detected there's a reduced space for intermediary action due to financial issues. So a lot of intermediaries get funding from different government grants, and there was reduced government funding on building energy efficiency. The economic climate was worse, so companies could not participate in so many like they could no longer be members to multiple sustainable energy groupings, so there was reduced membership funding for some of the actors, but also the social housing, some of the social housing companies were actually very good in intermediating and experimenting with new technologies, and certain legal requirements reduced their capacity. So this, in this context, this led to the battle of survival within the ecology of intermediaries. There were the political issues of key policies removed, which disrupted the initial long-term approach and targets, but also the organizational issue. Like I mentioned, there was kind of a striking number of actors which could be described as intermediaries. And obviously many of their activities were overlapping. And I think this sort of multiple organizations actually also created problems for each other, that there was more focus on competing for existence than actually intermediating for the transition. However, we want to emphasize in this study, or I want to emphasize the importance of the ecology of intermediaries. So you do need different types of intermediaries, because there are also so many different types of activities that we need in transitions, and to connect these different parts. So we need to kind of form an ecology of intermediaries that, depending on time, might be more or less in synergy and sometimes in conflicts. And policymakers can, to some degree, influence the ecology of intermediaries. They can grant funding, they can set up their own intermediaries, and in that sense, they have an important role. So I just want to end up with some recent developments and conclusions on this topic. And sorry, I go back here just to show that last year there was a special issue on intermediaries in accelerating transitions, and there because there was still there is starting to be research on intermediaries in the acceleration phase, but we kind of wanted to collect some ideas together, and I think this is still an important area for people to contribute. And here in this issue, we noted that there is a key distinction between intermediating the pre-development stage versus acceleration, because in the acceleration phase, the innovations are already there, and it's really more about diffusing innovations, creating knowledge and links between different types of actors, technology suppliers, adopters, users. It's about creating a new market or new markets where really intermediaries need to engage with a much broader group of actors than they have before, in particular users, but also sort of attracting businesses, trying to change policies. And it's really also about changing focus from experimentation and learning to this higher system level integration to create common expectations and coherence. So really it's about kind of capabilities or skills to intermediate between a broader set of stakeholders, and where also the niche regime boundaries get blurred. So it's in a way we could also think that there might be increasing contestation and tension. So of course there's the niche regime battle. Niche is trying to form a new regime, but there's also competition for survival for the intermediary actors themselves. There might be confusion among the actors. So in that sense, I really welcome also future research on this kind of a bit more like blurry issues and also these kind of more conflicts that might come about when transitions are advancing. Just wanted to also mention the recent expansions to the literature. As you noted, there are several papers last year. There's work on intermediation in diffusion processes, more about how intermediaries position and legitimize themselves. There's work on intermediary spaces, work on non-human agency, and there are also applications of intermediary thinking in different contexts, whether it's industrial symbiosis, SME support, or incumbency, and there are others as well. So there's quite a lot happening in this area. So now I just want to conclude, and I'm looking forward to your questions. So really, intermediaries operate among other actors in transitions. So they're by no means the important actor, but they are an important actor in a sense that if they are missing transitions, it's difficult to see how transitions would advance because the interaction between actors is important. The processes of intermediation are more important than who intermediaries are. So we should look at what are the kind of key processes and where they are happening and where they're missing. Public policies, like I mentioned, they create or reduce institutional spaces for intermediaries. Intermediaries are not immune. They might emerge when policy is lacking, but then they have much less capacity to act. Intermediation changes shape over the course of transitions. They change their roles, the composition of the ecology of intermediaries. They might have their own battles for survival and also the kind of need to create new skills and knowledge. There is already an increasing amount of evidence on intermediaries in niche development, but more information is needed really on the dynamics in destabilization and acceleration, but also if we look at the other kind of key concepts of transition studies, also in transition management, technological innovation systems, and of course the other new questions in transitions. Thank you.